Oh, come in, come in. Ah, good to see you again. Do close the door and come in and have a seat. I've got this rather nice Tolkien-esque pipe out. In fact, this particular churchwarden was a present from the great guitarist Phil Kagi. Now, as I had the Tolkien pipe out, I thought we'd have another dip into the Lord of the Rings, and I want to read you a passage which, it's one of the great key moments in the whole book, and it's a conversation between Gandalf and Frodo, in which Frodo learns just what it is he's inherited and what it is he's bearing. It's a favourite of mine for lots of reasons, but not least because in this lovely illustrated edition it has, I think, one of the finest illustrations of the whole book. So this is Alan Lee. Now, here's the illustration. I'll show it to you now. Now, I first saw that illustration not in this book, but in one of the Tolkien calendars. And I cut it out, and I used to have it up on the wall of my study in Cambridge, just not far from the chair I habitually sat in. The chair in which I sat, and my students coming to see me would sometimes sit in the very chair that you're sitting in now. And we would talk. And sometimes the conversation would be open and deep enough that a student might begin to awake to the possibility that there was more than they'd been led to believe about life. It wasn't just a meaningless piece of happenstance in a material void. And they might begin to wake up to the idea that they were part of a much bigger, much longer, much deeper, much more important story than they'd first realised. And of course, in this conversation, that's just what happens with Frodo and Tolkien. So just occasionally, I would glance at that picture. They might glance at it too and think, well, perhaps there's more to this than we realise. So, Gandalf has begun to wonder about the ring that Frodo received from Bilbo, and he asks him to take it out. Give me the ring for a moment. Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it and handed it slowly to the wizard. It felt suddenly very heavy, as if neither it nor Frodo himself was in some way reluctant for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up. It looked to be made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings on it? He asked. No, said Frodo, there are none. It's quite plain, and it never shows a scratch or sign of wear. Well then, look. To Frodo's astonishment and distress, the wizard threw it suddenly into the middle of a glowing corner of the fire. Frodo gave a cry and groped for the tongs, but Gandalf held him back. Wait, he said in a commanding voice, giving Frodo a quick look from under his bristling eyebrows. No apparent change came over the ring. After a while, Gandalf got up, closed the shutters outside the window and drew the curtains. The room became dark and silent, though the clack of Sam's shears came now nearer to the windows could still be faintly heard in the garden. For a moment the wizard stood looking at the fire. Then he stooped and removed the ring to the hearth with the tongs, and at once picked it up. Frodo gasped. It's quite cool, said Gandalf. Take it. Frodo received it on his shrinking palm, which seemed to become thicker and heavier than ever. Hold it up, said Gandalf, and look closely. Frodo did so. He now saw fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the ring outside and inside, lines of fire that seemed to form letters of a flowing script. They shone piercingly bright and yet remote, as if out of great depth, and of course Tolkien, who made all these languages and letters, gives us the the writing. I cannot read the fiery letters, said Frodo in a quavering voice. It was going, I cannot read the fiery letters, said Frodo in a quavering voice. No, said Gandalf, but I can. The letters are elvish, of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this in the common tongue is what is said, close enough. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. It is only two lines of a verse long known in elven lore. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. He paused and then said slowly in a deep voice, This is the master ring, the one ring to rule them all. This is the one ring that he lost many ages ago to the great weakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it. Frodo sat silent and motionless. Fear seemed to stretch out a vast hand like a dark cloud rising in the east and looming up to engulf him. This ring, he stammered. How on earth did it come to me? Ah, said Gandalf, that is a very long story. The beginnings lie back in the black years which only the lore masters now remember. If I were to tell you all that tale, we should still be sitting here when spring had passed into winter. But last night I told you of Sauron the Great, the Dark Lord. The rumours that you have heard are true. He has indeed arisen again and left his hold in Mirkwood and returned to his ancient fastness in the Dark Tower of Mordor. That name even you hobbits have heard of, like a shadow on the borders of old stories. Always, after a defeat and a respite, the shadow takes another shape and grows again. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf. So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look black. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. We should be hard put to it. We should be very hard put to it, even if it were not for this dreadful chance. The enemy still lacks the one thing that to give him strength and knowledge, to beat down all resistance, break the last defences, and cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring. Now that little exchange about the times we live in, between the exchange between Frodo and Gandalf, is justly famous. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. Now, if anyone had authority and experience to write those lines, it was J.R.R. Tolkien. He was born into and grew up through one of the most decisive and dreadful times in the history of humanity, actually. He was of that extraordinary young generation who just come to age and early manhood when the catastrophe of the First World War swept across Europe. And like his friend C.S. Lewis, he was a young officer out on the Western Front. Of course, he wished not to have been born in such times, but he was able to make a choice about what to do with the time that was given him. And we know that a lot of the details of things like the desolation in front of Mordor and the Midgewater marshes with the bodies decomposing in the pools, all of that is drawn on his experience, from his experience in the war. And then, when they thought that was all done and dealt with, 20 years later, the whole thing began to come again, and again a darkness grew in the east. Lewis and Tolkien were beyond fighting and conscription age in those days, but they still did their bits. Lewis famously with his wartime broadcast. And again, a darkness was defeated and laid to rest. And our generation, certainly my generation, were born into an extraordinary time of peace and security in Europe. And we could thank our lucky stars that we weren't born in those darker times, and we could honour the generations, our parents' generations, who were. But I do feel a fresh resonance when I read these words now. I think we are again living in such times. Just the very phrases that he used about a darkness. There is fear seemed to stretch out like a vast hand, like a dark cloud rising in the east and looming up to engulf him. And certainly on these shores, even as an island off Europe, we feel that. We feel menace and threat. We feel uncertainty. We feel gathering clouds. And once again, we reach into the deep stories that give us hope. And this is just such a deep story. And those words of Gandalf's, that of course we all who live to see such times wish it needn't have happened in their time. It's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And we find ourselves, as Frodo did, caught up in a great story. And it's a great story full of danger, but not without hope. And I reread this book afresh with both the sense of the danger, but also the promise of the hope. Anyway, so much more to a book as time goes by. A really great book has wisdom that it keeps giving and re-giving into all the times, even the seemingly darkening time in which you and I now find ourselves living. So, courage, mon frère. Anyway, good of you to drop round, and thanks for calling round.